across the floor again, and I'd like to welcome Rafe Heydel-Mankoo to take the floor. Rafe is an author, broadcaster and historian specialising in British institutions, the Monarchy and the Commonwealth Realms. From the BBC to ABC, Rafe is a well-known commentator in national and international media. He is a trustee of the Royal Canadian Heritage Trust and a senior fellow at the New Cultural Forum think tank. Rafe, the floor is yours.
Right. Round two. I've been on the winning side of every debate, apart from one at the University of East Sussex over the years, but I somehow suspect that this may not be following along those previous lines, but let's see how we go here. It's a great pleasure to be invited back to this august chamber and to see such a full house and a very enthusiastic, if not energetic crowd here today. It's been 7 years since I was last here, and university campuses and this chamber were rather quieter in those days, and undoubtedly one of the factors that's contributed to this increased passion is the emotion that envelops topics like colonialism and empire, and I say this also as a child of empire. But, you know, in recent months, we've seen the issue of slavery and colonialism expand beyond campuses, as we've now got, of course, from Barbados to Jamaica, prominent Caribbeans also calling for Britain to pay reparations for slavery and the consequences of colonialism. And, Madam Speaker, were we engaged in this debate in 1807 or 1833, I likely would have crossed the floor to support the motion opposite, because, of course, the victims of the horrendous horrors of slavery would have been alive and deserving of damages. But it's not 1807, it's not 1907, it's not even 2007. Over 2 centuries have passed since Britain led the world as the first empire in history to abolish slavery, and the right of reparations died long ago, because reparations are fundamentally about matters of tort law. The purposes of damages, restoration, of reparation, is to restore the victim, the slave, to the position they were in before the damage occurred, slavery. The actual victim only can receive damages, not their descendants. And therein lies the rub, because some 6 or 7 generations separate those alive today from their British Empire slave ancestors. And whilst not just yet, thank you so much. Whilst it's undeniable that 19th century slaves suffered unspeakable horrors, in what way can this lead one to conclude that their great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren are also victims and deserving of reparations too? On the contrary, from Britain to the Caribbean, the descendants of slaves today have a far better and higher quality of life than they would have had their ancestors remained in Africa. And that's an indisputable fact. Well, if you let me carry on, I'll tell you why. But first I ask you, is a current descendant of a slave ethically entitled to benefit from their ancestors' sufferings? And who should pay? Is it ethical for an innocent person today to be culpable for the sins of their forefathers? Now, CARICOM, which is the Caribbean body calling for reparations, wants British taxpayers to pay. But why? Out of a population of millions, there were only 3,000 slave owners in Britain. The vast majority of the population of Britain descend from people whose lives were one of abject poverty and hardship, working in hellish conditions akin to serfdom. Why should they, as taxpayers, pay reparations? It's not just yet, thank you so much. 16% of the British population is now also foreign-born, so why should they pay for reparations? What about the descendants of slaves living in Britain today? Why should people from Trinidad and Tobago living here pay reparations to people in Jamaica? Then again, why is the demand for reparations always focused and framed in terms of Britain? Why are no activists asking for reparations from the African states that were equally complicit in slavery? Should they not pay reparations? They provided the slaves that were transferred over the ocean, and millions more slaves were kept in slavery in Africa by other Africans, just as were being transported across the Atlantic. Why does nobody ever actually speak about that unpleasant truth? What about the Arabs and the Muslims who bought and sold African slaves for centuries before the British arrived and continue to do so into the 20th century until the British and the French tried to stop it. And indeed, what about the slavery that carries on today? The International Labour Organization says that currently approximately 7 in every 1,000 Africans is a slave. 10 million people. In 2017, CNN reported hundreds of slaves are sold every week in Libya. So much energy is given to historic reparations and the historic plight of slaves. I would have more time for the argument if the people actively pursuing that course of action were equally vocal about surely the far more horrendous plight of slaves today, where there are more slaves today in bondage, in slavery, than crossed over the Atlantic. So where are the protests outside the Nigerian High Commission? Where are the protests outside the embassies of Niger, which has 800,000 slaves today? What about Mali and Chad and Sudan and Cameroon? It's almost as if there's an ulterior motivation behind the call for apologies and reparations exclusively from Britain. And how far should we... No, I would love to, and normally I would, maybe a bit later on, but I'm getting into the swing of things now. And how far should we take this? Should Britain seek reparations for the Barbary slaves? 1 million Europeans, at the same time as Africans were going over the Atlantic, 1 million Europeans were enslaved by the Ottoman states of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And it carried on after the abolition of the slave trade by the British. Should Britain demand reparations from North Africa? Of course not. It's time to move on, and so should we. But let's turn away from slavery and expand our view to colonialism more broadly. What disadvantage has colonialism actually caused to those living in the former British colonies of the Caribbean? And disadvantage compared to whom? And this is to go back to the point that you asked. Most of the former colonies of the Caribbean are now successful middle-income countries. The GDP per head of the Bahamas is higher than Portugal and is comparable to Spain and Italy. You never hear that, do you? Barbados, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, and other former British slave colonies have higher rankings on the UN's Human Development Index than Brazil, Mexico, or many other Spanish-speaking South American countries. How has the British Empire disadvantaged the Caribbean nations? It's not clear to me. But let's test this further, and let's go and look and compare the nations of the Caribbean with modern West Africa, the original homelands of Caribbean slaves, to see what life is like there. GDP per capita in Benin is $1,430. In Barbados, it's $17,000, over 10 times higher. Life expectancy in Benin is 62, in Barbados it is 79. Rather than writing checks to well-off areas of the world, why not focus on countries and areas that are actually impoverished and require aid? Financial aid not attached to alleged attempts to cleanse one's soul. It can't be clearer. While slavery was abhorrent for those who were enslaved, had they stayed in Africa, the lives of their descendants today would be unquestionably worse. So what exactly, actually, is Britain being asked to pay reparations for? Because Britain wasn't the first empire in Africa, in India, in the Americas, but it was the most benign, and the benefits from it far exceed those, for example, of the Islamic and Indian empires that carved up India, of the Ashanti Empire, of the Dahomey Kingdom, and all of the hundreds and thousands of slaves that were ritually sacrificed every year in Benin. And the Benin Bronzes were mentioned. The Benin Bronzes commemorates those who actually owned slaves. So whilst on the one hand I can understand why you would protest Coulston's statue, why is there a celebration of the Benin Bronzes when they also commemorate slave owners? Yes, please.
How do you account for things like the racialized wealth gap in Britain today and for the fact that England did pay reparations, but they paid it to slave owners to the tune of $21 billion by current estimations?
And I find this argument very interesting. 40%, you're quite right, 40% of the budget was spent on freeing the slaves by paying off their owners. But the practical reality was the abolition of the slave trade would never have happened had it not been for that. Because of those 3,000 slave owners, for many of them, that was their only source of income and investment. And it would never have passed through Parliament No, but one has to be factual and practical. If you want to abolish slavery, one has to compromise, and that was how it was done. The slave trade didn't fuel the Industrial Revolution. The slave trade was abolished far too early. Only 5% of GDP was allied with the slave trade. So why are we apologizing for Britain? Are we apologizing to Britain for introducing nutrition and food storage policies that led to a decline in the subcontinent's processes of famine that happened every 40 years? In India there was a famine. The population of India soared from 170 million to 450 million over the course of the Raj because of medicine, health, and accurate and proper nutritional standards and food storage compared to how it had been. There had never been in history of India such a surge in population growth. And let's not forget also what Britain did for women's rights, because I think it's fair to say that it's thanks to the British Empire that we have had the progression of women in Africa and India through society. Because, of course, India's history is one of female oppression. It was the British who abolished sutti, the burning of widows on the funeral pyre of their husbands. It was the British that stopped the infanticide of young girls. And it was the British who allowed Hindu widows to remarry. I'm sorry if you don't like the facts, but facts are actually facts. Universities were brought into Africa and India by the British. It's quite... There will be no system of democratic legislatures within these regions. As Steven Pinker has written, pre-state societies before the British Empire arrived were on average far more violent than even the most brutal of modern states. So whilst many wrongs were committed in the 19th and 20th centuries, the modern success of Britain's former colonies today in the 21st century is due in large part to their colonial inheritance. The English language and the common law that enabled them to become global players, their civic institutions, the police, the military, the civil service, the judiciary, parliament, universities, every region of the world you go to, British colonies are the ones most likely to be the most developed, the wealthiest, and the most democratic. I therefore have no opposition in opposing tonight's motion, but I'd like to end by quoting the great black civil rights activist and socialist Bayard Rustin, a friend of Martin Luther King Jr.'s and posthumous recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama, who said, "If my great-grandfather picked cotton for 50 years, then he may deserve some money, but he's dead and gone, and nobody owes me anything." Thank you.